Hello and welcome to another episode talking about oil and gas and the energy show. I'm very pleased to say that today I've got Neil Young, the CEO and president of Elixir Energy, who's going to be talking us through a whole range of topics. Neil, good to see you. How are you?
Merlin, I'm very, very good. Not quite as good as a boy just back from Chile, but no, I'm still going very well. Thanks.
Good. Now, we last spoke 6 weeks ago. You at that time you kind of mentioned the consolidation in the on the oil and gas sector among the big boys. We'll catch up on that, but of course, I think the big show in town is what's happening at COP at the moment, COP28. It's such an interesting situation, being held in a fossil fuel and oil producing nation. The OPEC members are standing up and saying, hang on, let's not phase out fossil fuels just yet. And kind of the Western media are kind of up in arms and saying, don't they know we've got a climate crisis going on? So I'd love to hear your thoughts about the kind of the dynamics at COP28 and kind of what you're seeing coming out of that.
Well, thanks, Merlin. It's clearly a fascinating topic in multiple aspects that feeds into our industry in very immediate ways. As I see it, the key tension that is very visibly illustrated here is that a lot of people hope that by retarding supply, demand will naturally fall and that then carbon emissions will fall and the world will be saved. But the reality is that supply follows demand in oil and gas. And that if you retard supply, say, by Western companies, then OPEC will increase its supply. So you don't change a thing.
Or the other thing is that you drive prices up.
Exactly, and at some point, and maybe this is the intention, I mean, oil and gas demand is very inelastic, but it's not infinitely inelastic. So if you stop all supply, then you stop all demand. But the reality is that it is very inelastic, and so you're just really shifting supply around. And I think that this is driven partly by people's strong recollection that the tobacco industry was a supply-led industry. It induced demand, and that people fought against that, and that by retarding supply, they stopped demand. So going, oh, great, let's do that in oil and gas, and we can be the heroes of today. But energy is not tobacco. It's not a voluntary consumption item. It is demand-driven. And if policymakers want to reduce demand, they should put in place mechanisms to do so through taxes or subsidizing replacements or whatever. But by directly attacking supply doesn't really fix anything.
Well, it's a really, really key point. And as you're talking, a couple of things are popping up. One is that it seems as if the German Green Party and the politics of Germany have been strong enough to tackle supply of energy into Germany. And what we've seen there is two things. One is costs have risen. So the cost of electricity in Germany is much higher. An unfortunate byproduct is that the energy has become dirtier. The CO2 emissions have risen a lot. But the key thing is that energy demand has fallen in Germany. It really has fallen. If you look at energy consumption and industrial manufacturing, it's fallen. But it hasn't disappeared. It's just gone to China. So it's kind of been displaced. So what they've done is a kind of economic harm to their own country and kind of environmental harm by sending the manufacturing off to places where the grid is coal-fired and much dirtier.
I mean, that offshoring phenomena is not uncommon in the Western world, but I think what we also see there are changes in population, not in absolute numbers, but in terms of aging. And as you get, historically you might have had 10% of people over the age of 60, but now you've got 20 or 30%, they consume less. Now, it's obviously good for them, but in terms of the dynamism of the economy, it's not necessarily good and not necessarily sustainable. So I think that energy profile reflects, as you say, onshoring, but then also changes in the form of population age distribution.
So you're effectively saying that the developing world has got a younger population and that's where the demand is going to be coming from?
Absolutely, because even if you have poor governance, you can't help but growing at 3 or 4% a year because you just copy things and you've got a big demographic bulge to go and take advantage of. You run things half well, you can grow at 5 to 10% a year or more if you're better than that. And that sort of growth is incredibly hard to satisfy with forms of energy which aren't dense and which are expensive and intermittent. And to expect people to forego demand, again, not supply, is not judging human nature accurately. And I think the human nature is very, very powerful. We evolved through a certain aspiration through species to grow, and to try and retard that demand is antithetical to the origin of species almost.
So we're at the last day now of COP28. When this broadcast goes out, we'll probably have had the conclusion of it. But they're debating at the moment now whether there's going to be kind of phraseology in the final speech, that's the final text, that's the kind of the product of the conference, about whether there will be phasing out of fossil fuels. Now, you've just succinctly described how that primary demand is so vital to kind of that human instinct. Would you advise, if you were kind of chairing the panel at COP28 now, would you be advise them not to include phasing out of fossil fuels in that text?
I mean, if they do, it's a political statement, not a realistic one. I mean, I think even the IEA, who obviously represents richer countries in the world, recognizes that you're going to need fossil fuels in some shape or form for certain needs which can't be met by other supply sources, really, forever, however long forever is. And that by being too absolutist about it, you're not recognizing that you're going to need to invest a lot in CCS. Also, by being absolutist about it, and I noticed this week something from COP28 about some Western scientists saying, "Well, stop eating meat," and blah 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 blah. And I just read it and thought, you're just feeding the Trumps of this world. You're just going to help them win by giving them limes. You need to be realistic, not absolutist. So I think that, to go back to your question, phasing things out is absolutist and acts against the interest in reducing emissions. You've got to be practical and look for solutions rather than statements.
So at the moment, we're sitting with oil prices at WTI at around $71 a barrel. At the start of the year, we were at about $75 a barrel, and we've traded up to $90 a barrel. So it's, the oil price has been relatively price bound, range bound over the course of the year. And there are people talking, I've seen reports by Citibank talking about OPEC needing to maintain the supply cuts. Otherwise, you could see oil prices halving in the course of the next 12 months. Do you have a view on kind of short-term oil price movements, or is that not really what kind of motivates your thought processes?
I think in our game, particularly if an explorer or whatever, you've got a long-term view. And so I think oil prices are very reflective of short-term views on, for instance, demand in China, or how much storage there is in Texas or whatever. I don't think they're reflective of long-term supply-demand balances. And I think any sort of analysis of futures curves showed no predictive ability at all. So I think, though, going to the absolute price, $70 is still not a bad price. And I think that clearly there's a demand issue just now with China's economy being fairly weak. But I think there's also a fascinating supply issue with America being incredibly strong. And that is, notwithstanding some people might whinge about a federal government that they don't like or whatever, in reality, oil supply to states is driven by the states. And they're doing more than 13 million barrels a day. It's the highest in the world. And that reflects the dynamism of the American economy and the oil and gas sector specifically. I was there recently for the first time since before COVID, and it's just so energizing for our sector to see how deep and enterprising it is. I mean, also, the OPEC cuts have been fairly effective. I think that they're being challenged now, which no doubt Citi is observing, by the smaller countries like Nigeria, whatever, chafing at the bit and wanting to go and break the rules. But I can see that discipline largely being held. But the Americans clearly, aren't in OPEC, and even if they were, they couldn't control their the Texans and 1,000 different companies. And then the Chinese economy will do what it does. And I think it's clear that the trajectory of Chinese demand growth has not plateaued, but certainly fallen, and that the focuses of the supreme leader are on other things other than economic growth, which is different than his predecessors.
going to the kind of the US supply side of things, do you see that continuing? Do you see that kind of dynamism? Because there's been a lot of talk about the kind of the shale growth profiles, the decline curves on the shales. Do you see that kind of being a kind of sustainable, dynamic sector going forward?
I mean, nothing's sustainable forever, so it's all what sort of periods that you look at. But when I've been reading a lot about this for a long time, and people were going, that shale curve is going to decline, in 2011 or in 2012, and I know it's 2023. When you can't keep putting wells in forever, but to underestimate the productivity improvement capability in places like the Permian Basin has proven to be, a fool's game. And the continuing consolidation that is centered around the Permian, but not driven there entirely, serves to illustrate that. So I think the Americans can keep doing a lot with what are now very old basins, and anywhere in the world would not be doing a fraction of what they're doing.
We kind of come back to your comments about demand and the developing nations needing it. One of the things I think about is kind of the difference between relative growth and absolute growth, and relative demand and absolute demand. So yes, we may see relative increase in non-fossil fuel demand profile, but on an absolute basis, we still need to grow the amount of oil that we produce on an annual basis. And whether that comes from OPEC countries or non-Western countries, developing nations, or the US, there's still that requirement for kind of absolute supply growth to match that demand.
Indeed, and that's even without taking account of depletion, which, the traditional reservoir, I don't know, 3, 4, 5, 6%, but in US shale basins will be a lot higher on an individual well basis. So even just to sort of keep still, you've got to keep doing a lot. And then to go invest to sustain growth, again, requires a lot. And clearly there's been some fabulous discoveries in the likes of offshore Guyana, and maybe we can talk about Venezuela later. Those things can continue. And interesting again to come back, those things are driven by, in effect, the majors and Western technology and application of great science and discipline by those companies, not really driven by NOCs, which is, I think, still shows that the importance of the super majors in developing new demand supply.
So the super majors develop new techniques for extracting oil that we're talking about. So you've got depletion to counter. We've got demand growth to inherent demand growth. So what I think you said is that you can't predict the short term, but you're very positive about the longer term demand growth, and the whole sector is demand driven rather than supply driven.
I mean, I am particularly for gas. I mean, I think we probably discussed this a month ago. I see oil and gas being slightly different. I think oil could be flat to slight decline. I think gas will be flat to growth. I mean, the emissions profile is different, and there are alternatives to oil's primary use in transport fuels for onshore vehicles. But the alternatives to gas for many things like high-intensity heat for cement making, or in effect its role in the electricity system, which will be increasingly called upon to replace oil, is not replaceable at this point. And there's no obvious technology that will do it.
When we last spoke, you also spoke about the consolidation in the sector, kind of reflecting the views that you kind of almost providing you the evidence that you're not a lone voice. There are other people in bigger companies that are thinking in this way. Have you seen any more progress on that front? Have there been other more M&A activity, which is kind of confirming your hypothesis?
There has. I mean, we spoke last time that the two deals that Exxon and Chevron had announced have now been followed up in the States with Occidental, I think, in the last few days, announcing like a $10 billion transaction, talk of Chesapeake doing something similar. Now, these things are largely focused in America, but not exclusively. I think the Chevron deal had significant elements about Guyana, which we mentioned earlier. We hypothesized before that Shell wouldn't move on BP, and I still think that'll happen. There's still a value gap for that to happen. But from Australia, where I sit, it's been manifest now with revelations that our two only remaining large oil and gas companies, Woodside and Santos, are in merger discussions, and I think that's entirely consistent with the US thematic. It's about scale. It's about becoming a top 10 player. For those companies, it's focused on LNG because it shows a gassy rather than oily place. Some of the premium plays are more focused on oil, but it's about doing more of what you do well, bigger and better. So I think that it's a hugely fascinating topic, and I think it will continue. For juniors like us who go, well, what does that mean for us? Well, I think it means a lot in terms of changing the ecosystem, that you need to start small and then someone buys you and then someone buys you, or you consolidate or you grow or whatever. And if there's only big boys and nothing in between, then there's a bit of a gap. That gap will be filled. I think it's fascinating. And I think that even the Woodside and Santos deal's not the end. I mean, I think that then provides a platform for a company which has been formed through a scrip-based merger, can then do a deal, so with Conoco, to have a dual-listed structure that then become big enough to compete with the super majors. So I can see it's not just a one round of dominoes. The dominoes might then spin round again.
Well, let's come. That's fascinating. Let's just kind of come down to that junior and that gap that you say that might be filled. Because the junior space is quite unloved. It's a bit like the metal space, the hard rock space. There's been a lack of investment. There's been a lack of price action, lack of available capital. Particularly, it's the lack of equity capital, which is reducing the work programs that juniors have been able to do. So, how do you see that changing? Do you think it's just a trickle down effect that people are going to wake up to it, or how might this play out?
I think that one consequence of the big mergers, and if I take the Woodside Santos one as an example, is that it will inevitably lead to spin-outs of what for them are not sort of tier 1 and tier 2 or material assets. So what I call is a South 32ization that will occur. And this was when BHP spun out its lower tier assets into South 32 as a separate listed vehicle. That then became liberated to go and chase middle tier things. And I would see that absolutely happening here in Australia and elsewhere around the world. Those things will be listed or will be held private, and that they will then fill up the gap. Ecosystems have no gaps get filled. That's what happens. I think also private equity, who cares less about ESG restrictions on these things, will see where there's money to be made, then money will flow. So I think it doesn't necessarily happen tomorrow, and the sector is suffering some of the headwinds that you've described. But when something can't go on forever, it won't. I think that's a quote from, I think, Nixon's Treasury Secretary, whose name I recall, but this is the only thing he's known for. I think it's a great quote. And so I think there's lots of things that will happen, not necessarily next week, but certainly in the next few years, and that will fill up that space, provide opportunities for consolidation, for farm-ins, for capital to flow down, etc. And of course, that can happen the other way. Some juniors will be successful in consolidating, taking a Pac-Man approach and really swallowing up peers, and then becoming bigger and bigger, and then attracting different tiers of capital, different forms of capital, and then again filling that mid-tier sector.
One of the things that I kind of look for is, who are going to be the buyers? Who's going to be the people buying the shares of the juniors and investing? And I find it really weird because I live in an echo chamber, which I think is full of kind of right-thinking people, because that's my echo chamber. And there's a kind of an acceptance of the requirements for primary energy and the importance of oil and gas, and the importance of kind of basic raw materials such as copper and tin and coal and all these key things which drive our society. And I'm flabbergasted whenever I switch on the mainstream media and I still see people fighting against it, whether that's Leonardo DiCaprio saying, let's close down the copper mine of Panama. I think, wow, do they still think like that?
I think that just comes back to that, misunderstanding the role of supply versus demand, and wanting to be a hero and be seen to be doing the right thing. But in the end of the day, money flows where it will get returns. And if I take the example of Berkshire Hathaway, which has been enormously successful, but also I think generally seen as an ethical company. And it sort of came to mind because Charlie Munger died recently. But Berkshire is now a big shareholder in Occidental. It's who is a consolidating player, and who knows what they'll do next. But I mean, they've made money in and out of oil and gas many times over the years because I see it as being fundamental to economies that grow and make people wealthier, and can do so in ethical fashions. So that's not a fashion-driven entity. That one that's been based on fundamentals for longer than I've been alive.
Let's go to Guyana. Let's go to Venezuela and Esquecibo and the discoveries offshore Guyana. What's your take on that situation?
I mean, it's clearly desperation by a dictator to go and distract from his appalling mismanagement of the economy. I mean, it's bizarre that Venezuela, which has got apparently the world's largest reserves, I don't know who certifies them, but apparently one reads they've got a lot of reserves, that they need more oil to be richer. They can't be rich from their own reserves. They want someone else's. But if I look at it, Guyana's reserves are offshore in deep water. They need the likes of Exxon to develop and produce them. And even if Venezuela invaded, they couldn't produce them. They don't have the skills to. So it's just utter folly and distraction by a dictator that's impoverished, most of the people in his country. So I don't see it happening. It's just arm waving. But even if it did happen, they don't get the offshore anyway. So big deal. You've got to get a bit more jungle. Well, you've got billions of barrels of reserves you haven't developed anyway. Go for that.
I've just been in South America, and the view there is that this is absolutely, as you describe, a bit of political posturing. When a political party is in trouble and a leader wants to whip up popular support, a war is a good way, or threatening a war is a good way to get people behind you. I mean, Margaret Thatcher did it in the UK, and Putin's done it. And it seems as if Maduro is exactly the same. And apparently there are only two ways in. One is over the beach and kind of over the water, and the other is through Brazil. That's where the roads are. And so the Brazilian have sent up a kind of a detachment of its army up to stop anybody coming in through Brazil. The Guinean army is apparently only 3,000 strong, and it's more like a kind of a reserve for the police. But I think the critical relationship appears to be with the states, who've apparently just released some of the punitive sanctions on Venezuela in terms of oil trading and kind of basic commodity flows and financial flows. So I think I'm just supporting your comments that this is a purely political gesture and a bit of posturing.
I think so, and maybe it's politically controversial. I think Margaret Thatcher was responding to a dictator doing that rather than initiating it.
Well, perhaps it came at a good time for her because the party wasn't doing particularly well at home. It has affected the share prices of a bunch of Guianan companies. I just seen it on the gold side. Some explorers there have seen their share prices come off. So even though it's posturing, it still doesn't help. Things in general.
Dictators do stupid things. We're clear it's a strong lesson from history.
Here we are. We've got COP28, which is sailing by, a lot of hot air, probably, and as we go to the end of the year, it is the kind of the short-term driver. Let's look at what happens in the Chinese demand. Is that kind of the most important thing in the short term to take us into 2024?
Yeah, it feels like it is, and I'll just go back through the COP28. Merlin. Something I think that was relevant and interesting was commitments to reduce methane emissions, which most of us know are more damaging in the short term to the greenhouse effect than carbon dioxide, and significant pledges on that front. And I think what that demonstrates is that you affect change by building brick by brick rather than making sweeping declarations that are hard to achieve. And so when I've seen the Western oil and gas companies in particular are making and continue to make significant efforts to reduce methane emissions. And not only is it good for the environment, but it's good for their pocket because that's a product that they can then sell. So, and I think that the developing nations have not been as good at reducing methane emissions, and really it's a function of governance. Methane emissions are worse in Turkmenistan, not in America. But as Americans, for instance, develop techniques that for instance, on valves or pumps or whatever, then those go global. So you have that sort of genuine technology spill around, not by edict, just by economics and capitalism. So I think that methane initiative is important and shows that there is progress being made, but it's not being progress by arm waving and posturing. It's by incremental change. And changing energy systems has to be incremental, and all history shows that. You just can't do things in years or even decades.
So I was just going to say that another thing that came out of COP was the nuclear word, which didn't feature at all in previous COPs, but actually has been quite prevalent in this COP. And I think over 22 countries have signed up to tripling their nuclear demand. Again, it's possibly a degree of politics and statement rather than action, but at least it's in the conversation now.
I mean, you're exactly right. And again, it's that incrementalism. I mean, it's I think it was Obama who said back in the day when people were less extreme that it's an all of the above solutions required. It's not picking winners. And again, I come back to one of my hobby horses, CCS. I mean, our environment minister in Australia recently saying it's not something we want to do. It's a backstop. It's like a goalie. If the ball comes through, you save it. But it's not. It's absolutely required in every scenario you can possibly posit. And so again, that's sort of like picking winners and that's got short-term political favorism within your own echo chambers. So yeah, I think the nuclear one is important. Is it going to save it by itself? No, but it's going to be a part of a whole suite of things which will affect beneficial change.
Neil, thank you very much for that. Always good to talk to you. Next time I'd like to dig a little bit more into CCS and understand a bit more about the mechanics and the pricing of that. But perhaps we can pick that up early in 2024.
Absolutely, Merlin. Great to talk to you. Happy Christmas to you and any viewers who follow the seasonal tradition. Thank you.